Welcome to the College of Architecture and Environmental Design Support Shop. Today we will be going over how to use the two table saws that we have in our wood shop. Before we start, remember that long hair must be tied back, loose clothing should be adjusted, and loose jewelry should be removed. User condition can also be a hazard, so if you didn't get much sleep the night before, are in a hurry, or are under the influence of any substance, please do not come to the shops. Next we'll move on to adjustments that can be made to the table saw blade. There are two blade adjustment cranks, one on the front that adjusts the height of the blade and one on the side that changes the angle of the blade. Both have a locking knob in the center of the crank that needs to be loosened before adjustments can be made. While you adjust the height of the blade, it is important to make sure that the blade is about 1/4 of an inch or 1 tooth above the surface of the material. Too much exposed blade can be a potential hazard while working. On the front of the table saw we have our controls area. Here we have the main power switch, which turns on power to the entire machine, and the paddle on-off switch, which will start and stop the blade. The paddle switch is designed so that if both your hands are occupied with your material, you can easily turn the saw off by hitting the switch with your leg. When it comes to turning the saw on after making a cut, the saw needs to come to a complete stop before you can turn it back on again. If you try to turn it back on before it comes to a complete stop, nothing will happen. When it comes to making cuts, freehand cuts are never allowed on the table saw. We always want to use one and only one guide while cutting, whether it be a rip fence, miter gauge, or crosscut sled, all of which will be described later. We never want to use two guides at one time because they have a potential to cause a pinch in the material, which would cause a kickback. And just as a precaution, make sure that no one is standing behind you when you are making a cut. Just in case something were to happen, we don't want your material hitting other students. Kickback can happen when the material gets pinched between the blade and the fence, or when internal stresses of the material pinch the blade itself while it's running. Both of these can potentially send your material flying back with great force. The first type of cut that we are going to be making is called a rip cut. This is a cut that goes along the grain of the material or along the long edge of a material without grain. The first thing that we do when we're making a rip cut is adjust the rip fence. To make an adjustment, lift the red handle on the rip fence to unlock it. When the handle is in the down position, the fence is locked and in place and cannot be moved. There is a distance indicator on the right side of the fence, which will be used to measure how far the fence is from the blade. Slide the fence so that the red line on the indicator lines up with the tick mark of the distance that you want to make your cut. Push down on the red handle to lock the fence in place, and now you are ready to make your cut. Place the material so that it lays flat on the table. Make sure to stand behind your material with both feet planted firmly on the floor. Push it up against the rip fence with your left hand, and then with your right hand, push the material with a smooth and steady motion until it is all the way past the blade. Always be cautious of where your hands are when using the table saw, and try to keep them at least 6 inches away from the blade. Reach over is another potential hazard that we try to avoid when using the table saw. This occurs when someone reaches over a moving blade with a potential to fall onto the blade. Maintain proper body and hand position, and reach over shouldn't be a problem. Turn the blade off with the paddle switch, and then you have successfully made a rip cut. Sometimes we need to make cuts that are less than 6 inches wide, and when we do this, we are required to use a push stick to keep our hands out of harm's way. Now we will demonstrate how to make a cut using the push sticks. It is similar to the process of making a general rip cut, but take a note on the differences. The blade is still 1/4 inch above the material, and the material is still placed flat on the table, where we start pushing with just our hands. Only once the material reaches the end of the table, we will start using the push sticks, which are conveniently placed on the rip fence. Holding the material in place with your left hand, grab the shoe with your right hand. Once we have our push sticks, we will finish the cut just as before, pushing the material all the way past the blade with a smooth and steady motion. Turn the blade off and you have successfully made a cut that is less than 6 inches wide. Another type of cut that we can make is a bevel cut, which utilizes the miter feature of the table saw. First we adjust the angle of the blade. This is done by using the crank on the side of the table saw. The blade can be tilted a maximum of 45 degrees away from the fence. One thing to remember about making bevel cuts is that since more of the blade face is exposed, there is a tendency for the material to be pulled away from the fence Make sure that you have proper body position and hand position when you're making cuts. Use the push sticks if necessary and push your material past the blade with a smooth and steady motion. A third type of cut we can make on the table saw is called a crosscut. A crosscut is when you make a cut across the grain or width of the material. There are two types of guides that can be used to make a crosscut: a miter gauge and a crosscut sled. We're going to start out with a miter gauge. The miter gauge slides nicely into the track of the table saw, which allows it to run parallel to the blade. Keep your hands out of the way of the blade and push your material all the way past the blade in a smooth and steady motion. Now you have made a cut using the miter gauge. Now I'll make a cut using the crosscut sled. This is a special guide that has been built to make crosscuts on the table saw easier. It goes on top of the table saw and fits in the same tracks as the miter gauge, which allows the sled to slide past the blade easily. Never install or remove the sled when the blade is spinning. While making a cut, make sure to hold your material up against the back of the sled with your fingers while keeping your hands out of the red danger area of the sled. Push the sled all the way past the blade with a smooth and steady motion to make your cut. Move the two pieces of your material out of the way of the blade and retract the sled. Turn the blade off and you have now completed a crosscut using the crosscut sled. The last cut is called a dado cut. A dado is a channel cut through your material. This is done by stacking multiple layers of blades together to increase the cutting width of the blade. One thing to remember is that a dado setup is never used to cut all the way through the material, and is instead only used for shallow cuts, or cuts that don't cut all the way through. If you want to make a dado cut, let one of the red shirts know so that they can set it up for you. Congratulations, you have now made it to the end of the table saw training video. Before we finish, we ask that whenever you are done using any tool, please clean up the area that you have been working in and reset the tool to how you found it. As one last reminder, if you ever have any questions at all, please ask a red shirt or shop technician for help.